The cross stood like a blasphemous monument against the crimson sky, its shadow stretching long across the alkali dust. From where I sat my horse that October evening in 1877, I could see the small figure nailed to the weathered wood, arms spread wide, head hanging forward like a broken doll. The desert wind carried the scent of creosote and something else, something that made my stomach turn. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her long black hair whipped in the breeze, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the dark stains running down the crude timber. Apache, by the look of her buckskin dress and the beadwork still clinging to her torn sleeves. Someone had taken considerable time and care to crucify this child, driving railroad spikes through her small wrists with the precision of a carpenter building a church. My horse, an old roan mare named Bertha, snorted and pawed the ground. She could smell death same as I could, but this wasn't death yet. The girl's chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. She was still fighting, still clinging to whatever thread of life remained in her small body. I'd seen plenty of cruelty in my 43 years, most of it wearing blue or gray uniforms during the war, but nothing quite like this. Nothing so calculated, so deliberately evil. Whoever had done this wanted her to suffer. Wanted her to die slow. The cross had been planted with care too, positioned where the road from Perdition Springs met the old stage route to Tucson. Anyone traveling between the settlements would have to see it. Would have to witness what remained of this Apache child. That's when I noticed the other thing that made my blood run cold as winter creek water. Carved into the base of the cross, still fresh enough that wood shavings littered the ground like fallen snow, were 3 words that changed everything I thought I knew about the decent folk of Perdition Springs. Remember Crow Feather. 24 hours earlier. Perdition Springs wasn't much more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled around a reliable water source, but it was home to near 300 souls trying to scratch out a living in the Arizona Territory. I'd ridden in that morning with a string of horses to sell and my usual plan to drink myself stupid at Murphy's Saloon before heading back to my ranch in the Dragoon Mountains. The town felt different that day, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. Conversation stopped when I walked by. Eyes followed me with more interest than usual. Even old Murphy, who'd been pouring whiskey for every drifter and cowpoke in the territory for 20 years, seemed nervous when I bellied up to his bar. "Heard there's been some Apache trouble south of here," I said, nursing my second whiskey and watching Murphy wipe down the same glass for the 5th time. "Nothing you need to worry about, Caleb," he replied without meeting my eyes. "Just rumors and such." That should have been my first warning. Murphy loved gossip more than he loved money, and that was saying something. For him to clam up about Indian trouble meant something was seriously wrong. The second warning came when I spotted Dr. Benjamin Hartley hurrying across the street with his medical bag, heading toward the church. Doc Hartley was a good man, one of the few in Perdition Springs who treat Apache same as white folk if they came to him bleeding. But he looked scared that day, glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to put a bullet in his back. The third warning was Sheriff Wade Morrison himself, standing on the church steps having what looked like a heated discussion with Reverend Thaddeus Pike. Morrison was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of mustache that covered half his face. He'd been keeping the peace in Perdition Springs for near 10 years, ever since the army pulled out and left us to fend for ourselves. Pike was the opposite, thin as a fence post, with wild gray hair and eyes that burned like a man who'd seen too much of hell and not enough of heaven. He'd built the church with his own 2 hands after arriving in town 5 years ago, and his sermons could make a hardened sinner weep with remorse or shake with righteous anger, depending on his mood. From where I stood outside Murphy's, I could hear their voices carrying on the dry wind. "Can't keep this buried forever, Wade," Pike was saying, his voice tight with emotion. "What we did." "What they did," Morrison interrupted. "We weren't even there, Reverend. You remember that. We were there in spirit. We're all complicit in what happened at Crowfeather Canyon. Every man, woman, and child in this town." That name again. Crowfeather. I'd never heard it before, but something about the way Pike said it made the hair on my neck stand up. Morrison grabbed the preacher by the arm, probably harder than he intended. "You keep that name out of your mouth, old man." Some stones are better left unturned. And some sins demand atonement, Pike shot back, pulling free. I won't be silenced, Wade. Not anymore. That's when Morrison noticed me watching from across the street. His face went hard as winter ground, and he said something quiet to Pike that made the preacher's face go white as fresh cotton. Then Morrison was walking toward me with that particular stride lawmen use when they want to make it clear you're not welcome. Afternoon, Caleb, he said, friendly enough, but his hand rested casual-like on the butt of his Colt. Heard you had some horses to sell. Word travels fast, I replied, finishing my whiskey and setting the glass down careful on the hitching rail. Though I'm starting to think maybe this isn't the best time to conduct business in Perdition Springs. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Might be you're right about that. Might be better if you finished your drinking and headed on back to your ranch before dark. Roads can be dangerous these days. It wasn't a suggestion. I nodded and touched my hat brim. Much obliged for the advice, Sheriff. But I didn't leave town. Not yet. Something was eating at me like a tick buried deep in my skin, and I'd learned long ago to pay attention when my instincts started screaming. Instead, I led my horses to the livery stable and told the boy there I'd be staying the night. That evening, I took my supper at the hotel dining room and listened to the other guests talk. Most were just passing through, a drummer selling patent medicine, a young couple heading to California, an old prospector who'd struck out in the Superstition Mountains. But they all mentioned the same thing, an unusual number of riders heading south out of town that morning, all heavily armed. Looked like a hunting party, the patent medicine man said, cutting into his steak with delicate precision. Though I couldn't say what they might be hunting in this godforsaken country. I could have told him, but I kept my mouth shut and finished my beans in silence. After dark, I walked over to the church. Pike was inside, kneeling before the altar with his head bowed. Candles flickered in the windows, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, and he looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Mr. McKinnon, he said, rising slowly to his feet. I wondered if you might come. Did you now? I walked down the center aisle, my boots echoing in the empty sanctuary. And why's that, Reverend? Pike was quiet for a long moment, staring at the crude wooden cross mounted behind the altar. Because you're not from here. Because you don't have blood on your hands like the rest of us. What happened at Crowfeather Canyon? The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Pike closed his eyes and I saw his shoulders shake, just once, like a man trying not to break down completely. Sit, he said finally. Please. This is a long story, and not an easy one to tell. I settled into the front pew, hat in my hands. Pike remained standing, his back to me, staring up at that cross. 3 years ago, he began, a group of Apache raiders hit the Murphy Ranch. Killed old Patrick Murphy, our saloon keeper's brother, and his wife. Took their 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. The whole town was up in arms, demanding justice. I'd heard similar stories before. Apache raids were a fact of life in the territory, though they'd become less common as the Army pushed most of the tribes onto reservations. Sheriff Morrison organized a posse, Pike continued. 23 men, all volunteers. They tracked the raiders south into the Dragoons, following sign and asking questions at every ranch and settlement they passed. And they found the children? Pike's laugh was bitter as alkali water. They found an Apache camp in Crowfeather Canyon. About 40 souls, men, women, children, elders. Peaceful camp, from what I understand now. These weren't raiders. They were farmers, if you can believe such a thing. Apache trying to live quiet, trying to stay out of the white man's way. My stomach was starting to turn, but I had to hear the rest. The posse found Murphy's children there, alive and unharmed. But Morrison said they couldn't just take the children and leave. Said the Apache would come after them, would raid again. He convinced the others that the only way to be truly safe was to. Pike's voice broke. He gripped the altar rail so hard his knuckles went white. They killed them all, Mr. McKinnon. Every last one. Men defending their families, women trying to protect their babies, children who barely came up to your waist. Morrison said it was necessary. Said it was justice. The church was so quiet I could hear the wind rattling the windows. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, long and mournful. But that wasn't the worst of it, Pike whispered. When they got back to town with Murphy's children, Morrison told everyone the Apache camp had fought to the death. Said they'd had no choice but to kill them all in the battle. Made heroes out of the whole damn posse. And you believed him? Pike turned around then, and I saw tears streaming down his withered cheeks. I wanted to believe him. We all did. It was easier than facing the truth. What truth? That we'd murdered 40 innocent people. That Murphy's children could have been rescued without firing a shot. That we'd committed a massacre and then lied about it for 3 years. I was quiet for a long time, processing what Pike had told me. Outside, that coyote howled again, answered by another from across the valley. So what's changed? I asked finally. Pike wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Dr. Hartley was there. Part of the posse. He's been carrying the guilt ever since, drinking himself to death one bottle at a time. Yesterday, he came to me and said he couldn't live with it anymore. Said he was going to confess everything to the territorial marshal. But he didn't. No. Because this morning, we found something that changed everything. Pike walked to a cabinet beside the altar and withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth. He laid it on the altar and pulled back the fabric, revealing a child's dress made of white buckskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. It was torn and stained with what looked like blood. Little Apache girl, maybe 4 years old when the posse killed her family. Morrison found her hiding in a cave, crying for her mother. He told the others she was dead, that he'd put her out of her misery. My blood turned to ice water. But he didn't. He took her. Kept her alive all this time, hidden away somewhere. Fed her just enough to keep breathing, but not enough to grow strong. Broke her spirit, broke her body. And when Dr. Hartley threatened to confess, Morrison decided to send a message. Pike's hands were shaking as he rewrapped the dress. He crucified her, Mr. McKinnon. Nailed that poor child to a cross and left her to die slow, right where anyone traveling the southern road would see her. A reminder of what happens to those who threaten the secret of Crow Feather Canyon. The rage that filled me then was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It started as a cold knot in my stomach and spread through my body like wildfire, until my hands were shaking and I could taste copper in my mouth. Where is she now? Still out there, as far as I know. Morrison forbade anyone from going near her. Said she was a lesson that needed to be learned. I stood up, settling my hat on my head. Not anymore, she isn't. The present moment. That's how I found myself sitting my horse in the desert twilight, staring at a crucified Apache child while my rage burned cold and steady as a winter fire. The cross stood maybe 8 feet tall, planted deep in the hardpan. The girl hung limp in her bonds, unconscious but still breathing. I dismounted and approached slowly, talking soft like I would to a spooked horse. Easy there, little one. I'm going to get you down from there. Her eyes fluttered open when I got close, dark as obsidian, filled with pain but still holding a spark of fierce life. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper of sound. Shoo, I said, examining the spikes driven through her wrists. Save your strength. The bastards had used railroad spikes, driven deep into the crossbeam. I'd need tools to get them out without doing more damage. My saddlebags held a small crowbar I used for horseshoeing, along with my medical kit, just basic supplies, but better than nothing. Working by moonlight, I managed to extract the spikes and lower her gently to the ground. She'd lost a lot of blood, and her wrists were mangled something terrible, but she was alive. That was what mattered. I wrapped her wounds as best I could and gave her water from my canteen, just small sips at first. She was delirious with fever and pain, muttering words in Apache that I couldn't understand. But when I lifted her onto my horse, she gripped my shirt with what little strength she had left. Crow. Feather. She whispered in English, clear as a bell. My blood turned to ice. You know about Crowfeather Canyon? Her dark eyes fixed on mine, burning with an intensity that seemed impossible in someone so young and broken. My family. That's when I understood. This wasn't just Morrison's victim. This was a survivor. The ride back to Perdition Springs took 3 hours through rough country, with me leading my horse and the girl draped across the saddle. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling in Apache, sometimes crying out in pain. Every step seemed to jar her wounded body, but there was nowhere else to take her. The town was dark except for the saloon and a few houses with lamplight in the windows. I headed straight for Doc Hartley's office, which sat above the barbershop on Main Street. The doc lived alone since his wife died of consumption 2 years back, and I figured he'd be either drunk or passed out by now. I pounded on his door until I heard footsteps on the stairs. Hartley opened up in his long underwear, holding a lantern and swaying slightly on his feet. He was drunk, all right, but not too far gone to function. Caleb? He squinted at me in the lamplight. What in hell? Then he saw the girl in my arms, and his face went white as fresh snow. Jesus Christ, he whispered. You brought her here? She needs doctoring, I said, pushing past him into the office. And you're going to provide it. I laid her on his examination table while he lit more lamps with shaking hands. In the full light, she looked even worse, pale as death, her small body racked with fever and infection. The wounds in her wrists had festered, and I could see bone through the torn flesh. This is madness, Hartley muttered, washing his hands in a basin. Morrison will kill us both when he finds out. Let me worry about Morrison. The doc worked in silence after that, cleaning and stitching her wounds with steady hands despite the whiskey on his breath. Whatever his sins, Benjamin Hartley was still a physician. The girl stirred once while he worked, looking up at me with those dark eyes. What's your name? I asked softly. She was quiet for so long I thought she'd passed out again. Then, barely a whisper, Maria. A Christian name. Someone had tried to make her white, to erase whatever Apache identity she'd had before Crowfeather Canyon. The rage in my chest flared hotter. Well, Maria, I said, you're safe now. I promise you that. Hartley finished his work and covered her with a clean blanket. She needs rest and medicine, he said. But she'll live if infection doesn't set in. Good. I helped myself to his whiskey bottle, taking a long pull. Now tell me about Crowfeather Canyon. All of it. The doc collapsed into a chair like a man whose legs had given out. Pike told you. Some. I want to hear your version. Hartley stared at the girl on his table, tears streaming down his cheeks. It was supposed to be a rescue mission. We tracked the raiders for 2 days, following their trail through some of the roughest country in the territory. When we found their camp, it looked peaceful enough. Children playing, women working hides, old men smoking pipes in the evening light. He took the bottle from me and drank deep. Morrison set me forward with a white flag. I spoke some Apache from my army days, enough to make myself understood. I asked about the Murphy children, and they brought them out immediately. Unharmed, well-fed, treated like family. The Apache chief, old man with gray braids and kind eyes, he was ready to return them with no conditions. Said he understood our concern. But Morrison had other ideas. Morrison said we couldn't trust them. Said they'd raid again as soon as we left. Got the other men worked up, talking about how many settlers had died in Apache raids over the years. Before I knew what was happening, someone started shooting. Hartley's hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the bottle. It wasn't a battle, Caleb. It was slaughter. Most of the Apache men were away hunting. We were killing women and children, old people who couldn't fight back. I tried to stop it, tried to get the men to see reason, but the blood was up. They wouldn't listen. And the girl? I found her hiding under her mother's body, covered in blood. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, just staring up at me with those eyes. Morrison said she was a witness, said she couldn't be allowed to live. But when it came time to, I couldn't do it. I told him she was dead and hid her in my medical supplies. So Morrison took her instead. Hartley nodded miserably. He said he'd find a use for her. I thought maybe he'd take her to one of the missions, let the priests raise her white. I never imagined he'd keep her like an animal. The girl stirred on the table, muttering something in Apache. Hartley leaned forward, listening. What's she saying? Something about her brother. She had a brother who escaped the massacre. She's been waiting for him to come back for her. That's when we heard boots on the stairs outside. Heavy boots, moving with purpose. Hartley went pale as old bones. Morrison, he whispered. The door burst open without ceremony. Sheriff Wade Morrison stood in the doorway with his gun drawn, taking in the scene with cold eyes. Behind him were two of his deputies, Tom Brady and Jake Stevens, both men I'd known to be decent enough until tonight. Well, Morrison said, stepping into the room. Looks like we got ourselves a problem. I kept my hands visible and away from my gun. Morrison was fast, and he had the drop on us. Only problem I see is a sick child who needs medical attention, I said. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's no child, McKinnon. That's evidence. Evidence of something that happened 3 years ago and needs to stay buried. Evidence of murder, you mean? Evidence of justice. Morrison's gun never wavered. Justice for Patrick Murphy and his family. Justice for every settler who died in Apache raids. Justice? I couldn't keep the disgust out of my voice. You murdered 40 innocent people and kept a little girl as your pet for 3 years. You call that justice? Morrison's face went hard. I call it necessary. You wouldn't understand. You weren't here when the raids were happening. Weren't here when we found Murphy's children, terrified and traumatized by their Apache captors. From what I hear, they were treated fine. They were brainwashed. Morrison snapped. The boy kept asking for his Apache father, kept trying to speak their heathen language. We had to beat that out of him. The girl on the table stirred again, and this time her eyes fixed on Morrison with an expression of pure hatred. She said something in Apache, low and vicious. Morrison backhanded her across the face without hesitation, and that's when I moved. I hit him low and hard, driving my shoulder into his midsection and slamming him back against the wall. His gun went off, the bullet splintering with somewhere above our heads. We went down in a tangle of arms and legs, fighting for control of his weapon. Morrison was bigger than me, but I was meaner. I got my hands around his throat and squeezed until his face turned purple. He clawed at my eyes, trying to break free, but I held on tight. That's when something cold and hard pressed against the back of my skull. Let him go, McKinnon. Tom Brady's voice, shaking but determined. I don't want to kill you, but I will. I released Morrison and raised my hand slowly. The sheriff climbed to his feet, gasping and rubbing his throat. You made a big mistake, McKinnon, he wheezed. Bigger than you know. He walked over to the examination table where Maria lay watching with those dark, fearless eyes. Morrison drew his gun and pressed the barrel against her forehead. 3 years I've kept this little savage alive, he said. 3 years of feeding her, housing her, keeping her as a reminder of what happens to those who cross the white man. But I think her usefulness has come to an end. Don't, I said. She's just a child. She's a witness. And witnesses can't be allowed to talk. That's when the church bell started ringing. It rang 12 times, then started over. Then over again. Someone was pulling that bell rope like their life depended on it, and the sound echoed through the night air like a call to arms. Morrison frowned, listening. What the hell? The door opened and Reverend Pike stepped inside, carrying an old Sharps rifle that looked like it could knock down a buffalo. Behind him came Dr. Hartley's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, and the hotel proprietor, James Wickham. Then more people, townspeople I recognized but didn't know well. Step away from the child, Wade, Pike said quietly. Morrison kept his gun pressed to Maria's head. This doesn't concern you, Reverend. Doesn't it? Pike's voice was steady as stone. Doesn't the murder of innocents concern a man of God? Doesn't the torture of children concern every decent human being? These people don't understand, Morrison said to his deputies. They weren't there. They don't know what had to be done. We know enough, said a new voice from the doorway. Murphy pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and shame. We know you lied to us, Wade. We know you made murderers out of decent men. Your brother, Morrison started. My brother would be ashamed of what we did in his name, Murphy cut him off. Patrick never wanted revenge. He wanted justice. There's a difference. More people crowded into the small office. I saw faces I recognized, the blacksmith, the general store owner, even some of the men who'd been part of the original posse. All of them looking at Morrison with disgust and horror. You can't all be here, Morrison said, but his voice had lost its confidence. You can't all know. Word travels fast in a small town, Pike said. Especially when it's the truth that's been buried for 3 years. Mrs. Chen stepped forward then, an elderly Chinese woman who'd been caring for Doc since his wife died. She looked at Maria with tears in her eyes and said something in what sounded like Cantonese. Then, in English, I know what it is to be different in this place. To be afraid. This child should not suffer for the sins of men. One by one, other townspeople stepped forward. Each of them looked at the girl on the table, then at Morrison with undisguised contempt. You're all making a mistake, Morrison said, but his gun hand was shaking now. If word of this gets out, if the territorial marshal learns what happened at Crowfeather Canyon, we'll all hang. Every man who rode with that posse, every person who kept the secret. Maybe we should, Murphy said quietly. Maybe that's what justice looks like. Morrison's face twisted with rage and desperation. I won't let you destroy this town over one Apache brat. He started to squeeze the trigger, but Maria was faster. Despite her wounds, despite 3 years of captivity and torture, she still had the reflexes of her people. Her small hand shot up and grabbed Morrison's wrist, deflecting his aim just enough. The gun went off, the bullet shattering a lamp instead of a skull. In the confusion that followed, Tom Brady made his choice. Instead of backing his sheriff, he tackled Morrison from behind, driving him to the floor. Enough! Brady shouted. This ends now. The fight went out of Morrison then. He lay on the floor, gasping like a landed fish, while Brady kicked his gun away. Jake Stevens looked around the room at all the faces staring at him and slowly raised his hands in surrender. I never wanted any part of this, he said. Never wanted to hurt anybody. Pike knelt beside the examination table and looked down at Maria with gentle eyes. Child, he said softly, do you understand English? She nodded weakly. My name is Thaddeus Pike. I'm a minister of God, and I want you to know that what was done to you and your family was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. We can never make it right, but we can try to make amends. Maria stared at him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, my brother. He will come for me. What's his name? Pike asked. Fierce Wolf. He escaped the killing place. He will come. Murphy stepped forward then, hat in his hands. Little girl, he said, his voice choked with emotion, my name is Sean Murphy. My brother Patrick, he was the one whose children were taken. What happened to your people, it was done in his name, but it wasn't what he would have wanted. Patrick was a good man. He would be ashamed of what we did. Maria looked at him with those dark, unforgiving eyes. Your brother's children. Where are they now? Murphy's face crumpled. Dead, he whispered. Both of them. Died of fever 2 winters ago. Nothing we did brought them back. Nothing we did served any purpose except to add more graves to the ground. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the church bell had stopped ringing, but I could hear voices in the street. Word was spreading through Perdition Springs like wildfire, and by morning, everyone would know the truth about Crowfeather Canyon. Dr. Hartley cleared his throat. She needs rest, he said. And proper medical care. Her wounds are serious, and she's been malnourished for years. She'll have whatever she needs, Pike said firmly. The church will see to it. And Morrison? I asked. Pike looked down at the broken sheriff with something that might have been pity. Wade Morrison will face justice. Real justice, not the twisted version he's been serving for 3 years. Morrison laughed bitterly from the floor. Justice? You think the territorial marshal gives a damn about dead Apaches? You think anyone in Washington cares what happens to a few savages in the middle of nowhere? Maybe not, Pike admitted. But God cares. And we care. And that has to be enough. 3 months later. The territorial marshal did come, eventually. A thin, serious man named Patterson who took statements from everyone involved and wrote everything down in careful script. There was talk of trials and hangings, but in the end, justice took a different form. Morrison was stripped of his badge and run out of town on a rail. Last I heard, he was working as a railroad guard somewhere in New Mexico territory, drinking himself to death 1 bottle at a time. Tom Brady took over as sheriff and proved to be a fair and honest lawman. Jake Stevens left town entirely, heading back east to family in Ohio. The other members of the original posse faced their own reckonings. Some left Perdition Springs in shame. Others stayed and tried to make amends in their own ways. Murphy donated his saloon to the church and became a vocal advocate for peaceful relations with the local Apache bands. Dr. Hartley sobered up and dedicated himself to treating anyone who needed medical care, regardless of race or ability to pay. The guilt would never leave him, but he channeled it into something resembling redemption. And Maria? She healed, slowly but surely. Pike and the church ladies nursed her back to health, teaching her to trust again, to laugh again. She learned to read and write English, though she never forgot her Apache tongue or the stories of her people. The best day came in early spring, when a lone Apache warrior rode into town under a white flag. He was young, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of a natural leader. He gave his name as Fierce Wolf and asked to speak with his sister. I was there when they reunited, and I'll never forget the sight of Maria running into her brother's arms, both of them crying and laughing and speaking rapid Apache while the whole town watched from a respectful distance. It was the first time I'd seen her truly smile since that night in the desert. Fierce Wolf stayed in Perdition Springs for a week, learning what had happened to his sister and his people. The pain in his eyes was terrible to see, but there was no hatred there. No desire for revenge. Just a deep, abiding sadness for all that had been lost. On his last day, he came to find me at Murphy's, now called Pike's Community House. I was playing cards with some of the local ranchers when he walked in, moving with that peculiar grace that all Apaches seemed to possess. Mr. McKinnon, he said in perfect English. I want to thank you for saving my sister's life. Anyone would have done the same, I replied, standing to shake his hand. He smiled sadly. You and I both know that's not true. But I'm grateful nonetheless. He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. This belonged to our father, he said, offering it to me. He was the chief who would have returned the Murphy children without bloodshed. I think he would want you to have it. Inside the wrapping was a knife with a bone handle, carved with intricate symbols. It was beautiful work, the blade polished to a mirror shine despite its obvious age. I can't take this, I said. You can and you will, Fierce Wolf replied firmly. It's not a gift. It's a debt being paid. You gave me back my sister. That's worth more than any weapon. He looked around the room then, taking in the faces of the men who'd once been part of the posse that murdered his family. Most of them couldn't meet his eyes. I want you all to know something, he said quietly. My people believe that hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it more than the one who deserves it. What happened at Crowfeather Canyon was wrong. Unforgivable. But I won't let it turn my heart to stone. He paused, his gaze settling on each man in turn. Maria and I will leave this place tomorrow. We'll go south to Mexico, where some of our relatives still live free. We won't come back. But before we go, I want you to make me a promise." "What kind of promise?" asked Brady. "Promise me you'll remember. Promise me you'll tell your children and your children's children what really happened at Crowfeather Canyon. Don't let the truth be buried again. Don't let our people's deaths be meaningless." One by one, the men in that room nodded their agreement. Even those who hadn't been part of the original massacre understood the weight of what Fierce Wolf was asking. The next morning, I watched from my hotel window as Maria and her brother rode out of Perdition Springs together. She looked like a different person, no longer the broken, crucified child I'd found in the desert, but a proud young Apache woman ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they reached the edge of town, she turned in her saddle and looked back. For just a moment, our eyes met across the distance, and she raised her hand in farewell. Then they were gone, disappearing into the vast expanse of desert and sky that had always been their true home. The present day. That was 43 years ago, and I'm an old man now, my hair white as winter snow and my hands gnarled with arthritis. Perdition Springs has grown into a proper town, with a railroad station and electric lights and all the modern conveniences. Most of the people who were there that night are dead and buried, their secrets gone with them to whatever judgment awaits us all. But I kept my promise to Fierce Wolf. I've told this story to anyone who would listen, and I've made sure it was written down in the town records where future generations can find it. The truth about Crowfeather Canyon is carved in stone now, literally. Pike had a monument erected in the town square before he died, listing the names of all 40 Apache who were killed that day. Sometimes I wonder what became of Maria and her brother. Did they find peace in Mexico? Did they start families of their own? Did Maria ever forgive us for what we took from her? I like to think they lived good lives, free from the hatred that could have consumed them. I like to think that somewhere in the mountains of Sonora, there are children and grandchildren who carry Apache blood and Apache stories, keeping alive the memory of a people who were nearly erased from this earth. The knife Fierce Wolf gave me sits on my mantel now, next to a photograph of Perdition Springs taken the day after that terrible night. In the picture, you can see the church where we gathered, the doctor's office where we made our stand, the street where a town confronted its own sins and chose redemption over continued lies. But if you look closely at the edge of the photograph, you can see something else, 2 small figures on horseback, silhouetted against the desert dawn. A brother and sister, riding toward whatever future awaited them beyond the horizon. That's the image I want to leave you with. Not the cross in the desert, not the crucified child, not the massacre at Crowfeather Canyon. But those 2 figures riding toward the sunrise, carrying their grief and their healing, their memories and their hope. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not the evil that men do, but the choice we all have to make, whether to let that evil define us, or to rise above it and become something better. Maria chose to rise. Fierce Wolf chose to forgive. And in their own small way, the people of Perdition Springs chose to face the truth and try to make amends. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to balance the scales of what was done at Crowfeather Canyon. But it was something. It was a start. And sometimes, in this hard country where life is cheap and mercy is rare, a start is all we can hope for. The desert remembers everything, every drop of blood spilled on its sand, every tear shed beneath its pitiless sun. But it also teaches us about endurance, about the stubborn refusal to give up even when all seems lost. That's the lesson I learned from a 12-year-old Apache girl who survived 3 years of hell and still found the strength to forgive. That's the wisdom passed down by a young warrior who chose peace over vengeance, understanding over hatred. The cross is gone now, rotted away by wind and weather and time. But the story remains, and the truth it represents will outlast all of us who lived through those dark days. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind blows just right, I swear I can hear them, the voices of the dead from Crowfeather Canyon, whispering their names to the stars. And sometimes, carried on that same wind, I hear something else, the sound of children laughing, somewhere far to the south, where the mountains meet the sky and the old ways still have meaning. That's when I know that Maria and Fierce Wolf found their peace at last. That's when I know that love really can triumph over hate, that healing really is possible, even in a world as broken as ours. And that's when I understand that the cross in the desert, for all its horror, gave birth to something beautiful in the end, not just justice, but mercy. Not just truth, but redemption. The desert remembers everything. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, it also forgives.